Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tocqueville Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Gross, Dr. Benjamin Gross at Jacksonville State University. It's a pleasure to have you all attending with us. We would love to have you here on campus, but let's make the best of the situation, and we're happy to have many of you join us digitally. So welcome, as I said, this is the Tocqueville Lecture Series. It is named after Alexis de Tocqueville, born of French aristocracy. Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. These are free public lectures which promote the campus of Jacksonville State University, other institutions of learning, and the surrounding community come together to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other in the spirit of association, very fitting for Tocqueville. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by a generous grant from the Jack Miller Center. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advocating education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. I'm happy today to present to you our first presenter of this series. He, I think, is perhaps the most fitting possible presenter we could have to start this series, Dr. Nicholas Buccola. He is a writer, lecturer, and teacher who specializes in the area of American political thought. He is the author of The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and The Debate Over Race in America, and The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass, In Pursuit of American Liberty. He is the editor of the essential Douglass Writings and Speeches, and Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy. He is the Elizabeth and Morris Glicksman Chair in Political Science at Linfield University in McMinnville, Oregon. At Linfield, he teaches courses in political theory and public law, coordinates the major in law, rights, and justice, and the founding director of the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice. He serves as the book review editor of the American Political Thought Journal through the University of Chicago Press. His essays have appeared in scholarly journals, including the Review of Politics and American Political Thought, as well as popular outlets such as the New York Times, Salon, the Baltimore Sun, and Dissent. With great pleasure, it's my joy to introduce you all to Dr. Nicholas Buccola.
Thanks so much, Ben. It's so great to be with all of you. I wish I was with you in Alabama, enjoying some of that great food you have down there. One of the highlights of my senior year in college was a spring break road trip from Atlanta through Alabama down into Florida, and so I really love visiting that part of the country. And Ben promises that once normalcy is restored, I'll make a trip out there to visit you on campus. So I really look forward to that. I'm really honored to join you at Jacksonville State, and I'm especially honored to be the inaugural Tocqueville lecture. I really admire what Ben is doing with this Tocqueville program, and I think any opportunity that we have to get together and think about these big questions, these questions that are central to our lives as citizens, I think is something that we should really savor, and it's so important for the health of our republic that we do that sort of thing. So I applaud Ben for taking the lead in this, and I think it's going to be a great series, and it really is my honor to kick it off. I'm also grateful to the Jack Miller Center. The Miller Center is actually Ben and I met back in the day at a Miller Center event, and I think the Miller Center is doing really important work in promoting this sort of activity, us getting together and reflecting together as citizens about these ideas that matter. And I'm just so grateful to Ben for being such a generous host, and I always love seeing Ben, such a great guy. And all of you students who are fortunate enough to have Professor Gross, be grateful, because there aren't. I imagine he's wonderful in the classroom, and so be grateful for the time you get to spend with Ben. I know he appreciates the time that he gets to spend with you. So tonight, Ben's gonna pull up my presentation. Most of the presentation are images, and I want to show you a number of images of the gentleman that I'm going to be discussing. So here we go. Is that coming through okay, Ben? Can you see that okay?
I think you need to bring up your desktop here.
Okay.
That's where we're at. Is that your desktop might not be sharing the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, let me try that again. So so I have my desktop here, got the power. I can see the PowerPoint, but you can't, right? Can you see it, Ben?
I cannot see your content right now. I just see your screen with the Microsoft Teams right now. So perhaps if you try to share your content one more time,
okay.
The system, we'll see if that.
So I'll try. So Ben and I did try this just so everybody knows beforehand, and it worked perfectly. But let's try it again. Here we go. So I just unshared and then resharing. Does that help?
Let's. I have your desk. There we go. There's your desktop, and I will bring. And there we go. Now we should be all set.
Okay, cool. So everybody can see my screen. All right, excellent. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about this book that Ben mentioned, "The Fire is Upon Us," and I'm going to start us out in this space here. So I'm going to go to my second slide. There we go. So this space right here, what you're looking at is the Cambridge Union in Cambridge, England. This is the world's oldest debating society, one of the world's most prestigious debating societies. This space on February 18th, 1965 was absolutely packed. Every spot in those benches that you can see was filled, mostly with undergraduate Cambridge University students. The galleries upstairs were filled. Indeed, there were so many students packed in to this hall that you couldn't see that hardwood floor that you can see in this image. There were so many students packed in, sitting on the floors, that the debaters had to step over the legs of many students as they made their way to their spots on the benches for the debate. That night, the students were packed into this space to hear a debate on the motion, "The American Dream is at the expense of the American Negro." That was the motion presented that night by these students. And the debaters that night were James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. The students were primarily drawn to the hall to see James Baldwin. Baldwin was, at that moment, one of the most famous writers in the world. He was, in the words of his friend Malcolm X, the poet of the Civil Rights Revolution. Baldwin was the leading literary figure associated with that phase in the Civil Rights Revolution in the United States. He was, through every genre you can imagine as a writer, he was trying to draw attention to the experience of those who were fighting for civil rights. And he was writing, as you'll see in a little bit, in all sorts of different areas, not just about civil rights, but about all sorts of topics. Baldwin was this world-famous writer, and so the students were primarily attracted by the opportunity to see this kind of poet-prophet of the Civil Rights Revolution in the flesh. The students were also intrigued by the prospect of seeing Baldwin share the stage, as it were, with William F. Buckley Jr. Buckley was about as different from Baldwin as you can imagine. Buckley was somebody who was the sort of one of the founding fathers of American conservatism. He was somebody, through his National Review magazine, this magazine that he founded in 1955 that I'll tell you about in a little bit, his thrice weekly newspaper column, his very active lecturing around the country. He gave upwards of 70 lectures a year, all over the place, debated all over the place. Buckley was somebody who used his voice and his pen to advocate conservative principles, and so he was drawn. The audience was drawn by the opportunity to see him square off with Baldwin, because another important thing they knew about Buckley, they found out about Buckley in the weeks leading up to the debate, was that Buckley was hostile to, skeptical of the Civil Rights Revolution that in many ways Baldwin embodied. So the crowd was drawn that night by the opportunity to see this kind of intellectual clash. There were over 700 students packed into this space. You can see 500 more packed into other rooms on the Union premises, even more lined up outside trying to get in. The BBC was there to record it. It would be this international television event as well. And what I do in the book is I try to, that night constitutes 2 climactic chapters in the book. So I start out the book in that, that scene, February 18, 1965. But then I go back in time. So you have to, if you read the book, you start out here in the Cambridge Union, and then you have to wait 250 pages before you get back. As you can see, the paperback edition, it's a pretty thick book. And the reason it's so thick is because the story that I wanted to tell in the book, the story I realized I had to tell to really tell the story of the debate, was the backstory. Baldwin is born in 1924. Buckley is born in 1925. They're almost exact contemporaries. And really, I wanted to tell the story of not only their upbringing, but more importantly, their intellectual lives. I wanted to sort of weave their intellectual biographies against the backdrop of the civil rights and conservative movements, these 2 movements that they did so much to shape. And so that's the story of the book. That's why it's such a long book. And I want to give you a sense tonight of a little bit of that story, give you a sort of a sense of Baldwin and Buckley leading up to that night. And then I'll play a couple clips from the debate, from the BBC recording of the debate, and then wrap up my presentation, and we'll have time for Q&A. And so as we go through the presentation, please think about questions, comments that you have, and we'll have time for conversation in just a little bit. So with that, I will go to the next slide. All right, so James Baldwin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about young James Baldwin. Baldwin is born in August 1924 in Harlem. And Baldwin, one of the things that he emphasizes as a writer is that, the most important source of information, the most important source of wisdom for a writer is the writer's own experiences. And so Baldwin, in his fiction and his nonfiction, he reflects on the experience of growing up in Harlem in the 20s and 30s. And what Baldwin tells us about those years for families like his own, Baldwin was the oldest of 9 children. And Baldwin says that the experiences of his family and the folks like his family was an experience marked by domination. He talks about all the ways in which he was limited and dominated by the society around him. Sometimes that domination had a human face. He talks about, and you'll see this in the Cambridge clip, the policemen, the landladies, the landlords, the insurance agents, the shopkeepers, etc., who communicated to him that he was a worthless human being. So he describes that kind of domination that he experienced from the individuals around him. He also describes a kind of domination without a human face, a domination that he says came from the bottomlessly cruel structures of power that limited his freedom and opportunity as an individual and limited the freedom and opportunity of those he saw around him. And in that context, Baldwin most powerfully, I think, describes what that sort of domination did to his father. So his father, David Baldwin, he says, was somebody who was consumed by that domination, really consumed by despair. David Baldwin ends up dying in an institution for the mentally ill in 1943. And James Baldwin says that his father was really came to believe everything the white world said about him. And he was sort of consumed by this self-hatred, and that self-hatred led him to immense cruelty toward those around him. One of the most powerful moments for me in reading Baldwin's descriptions of his father is Baldwin says that I can't remember a single moment when any of my father's 9 children were happy to see him come home. And that to me just sort of tells you a little bit about the sort of despair that consumed David Baldwin. And so James Baldwin describes that, and he's sort of describing what it was like to grow up in those years. But it's a mistake to leave the story there, because Baldwin not only tells the story of domination, he also tells important stories of resistance and of resilience and of joy. And so I think it's really important to know about young James Baldwin that Baldwin says that in the face of that kind of domination, one has to find what he called a handle, a lever, something to hang on to, something to use to fight back. And for James Baldwin, that handle, that lever was language. Baldwin was somebody who was obsessed with books. From a very young age, he read everything he could get his hands on. He said, as soon as I read everything that was of interest in the library that was closest to my home, I began venturing to libraries where I was not supposed to go. And I was often reminded by police officers and others that I was going beyond the boundaries of where I was supposed to be. But Baldwin reads everything. He's fascinated by the ability that authors have to connect people across time and space. So he finds, for example, so much that he can relate to in the novels of Charles Dickens. And at a very young age, Baldwin begins to write. He sets pen to paper and he tries to utilize writing as a way to make sense of the world around him and to, in some ways, fight back against it. And Baldwin also becomes a young minister. One of the things that Baldwin had a very difficult relationship with his father, the aforementioned David Baldwin. But the one thing they had in common was they were both preachers. David Baldwin was a lay Pentecostal preacher in Harlem storefront churches, and James Baldwin becomes a young minister from the age of 14 to 17. Baldwin is a preacher, and although he leaves the church, I argue in the book, and I'll argue tonight, that Baldwin he remained forever a preacher. Baldwin was somebody who was very gifted as a preacher. He says there's nothing quite like that feeling of communing with one's flock and sort of feeling united in the word. He said in those moments you can feel the church begin to rock. And so there's something about Baldwin as a preacher that I want you to keep in mind, because when he arrives at Cambridge in 1965, in many ways he delivers a sermon. And so meanwhile, William F. Buckley Jr. is born only 15 months later. He's born in the same city. He's born in New York City. But as I say in the book, Buckley may as well have been born on a different planet. William F. Buckley is a son of privilege. He is born to immense wealth. And Buckley describes being born into this family. His father was a real estate and oil man who made, lost, and regained fortunes over the years, both business in the U.S. and abroad. And his mother, Aloise Steiner Buckley, called herself a proud daughter of the Confederacy. She was from New Orleans. So Aloise was from this wealthy family, came from old money. Will Buckley, William F. Buckley Sr., came from new money. The key word there is money, lots and lots of money. And with that money, the Buckleys provided quite a lifestyle for their 10 children, and William F. Buckley Jr. being right in the middle of that 10. They purchased a 47-acre estate known as Great Elm in Sharon, Connecticut. And on that estate, so James Baldwin, when he's describing life in Harlem, he says one of the words that you should keep in mind is the word claustrophobia. Baldwin asks us to imagine what it would be like to wake up in a room with no windows, sharing a bed with several of your siblings. The kind of claustrophobic pounding in the skull that would lead to. William F. Buckley, on the other hand, describes seemingly limitless space. He's growing up on this 47-acre estate. Of course, this vast mansion on the estate, and all these vast outdoor activities that he can attend to. And most importantly for the Buckley children, they were homeschooled, and they were provided with a very particular kind of homeschooling that was directed by their parents, but also directed by live-in tutors. They had full-time teachers who lived with them at the estate. They brought in part-time tutors as well to teach the Buckley children everything under the sun. If you read the description of the sorts of things they were taught, it reads like a course catalog for a major university. Every subject you can imagine is there. But most importantly for our purposes, the Buckley children were taught a particular worldview. They were taught to believe. They were very devoutly Catholic. They had a particular brand of Catholicism that was central to their worldview. But more importantly for our purposes, they had a political and moral doctrine that they called individualism. And for the Buckleys, this doctrine of individualism was really a catch-all term for meant to capture their hostility to any form of collectivism. Communism, they were staunchly anti-communist, socialism, and they were also deeply opposed to the New Deal policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But perhaps even more importantly than that, the Buckleys were very suspicious of democracy. The Buckley children were taught that some people are fit to rule and others are fit to be ruled. And good news, Buckley children, you are fit to rule. And so the Buckley children are taught this doctrine, and it's really important to know that that's philosophy of hierarchy that they were taught from a very early age was thoroughly racialized in the household. So Buckley's parents, by any definition, and even the children themselves acknowledge this, were racist by any definition. They taught their children to believe in a kind of natural racial hierarchy. But this was very important for William F. Buckley. That racism that they taught us was not a racism that was rooted in animus. So William F. Buckley Jr. would often reflect on his mother, and Buckley's siblings would reflect on their mother, Aloise, who taught them to believe in racial hierarchy, but also taught them to believe that they, as superiors, had an obligation to take care of those beneath them. So it was this kind of noblesse oblige philosophy that they were taught. And they were also, I think part of that, though, was that Alois said, we're especially indebted to those beneath us who are loyal. And I think you can imagine where this might lead in terms of Buckley's own racial politics that he'll develop later in life. So with that as our foundation, let's consider Baldwin and Buckley as they get a little bit older and they sort of arrive on the intellectual scene or come of age on the intellectual scene in the late 40s and early 1950s. Buckley arrived, well, first of all, he goes to Millbrook Prep School, which is an elite prep school, and then he serves for 2 years in the U.S. Army. And he enrolls in Yale after his service in the Army as a 21-year-old freshman. And what you can see here is Buckley at his desk as the chairman, as they called it, of the Yale Daily News, the student newspaper. And Buckley, when he arrives at Yale, he says he's hoping and he expects to find professors there and a kind of academic culture there that will reinforce his Christian and individualist beliefs. Not Catholic beliefs. He knows it's a predominantly Protestant place, but he hopes that it will reinforce his Christian beliefs and that doctrine of individualism I described a moment ago. Well, Buckley says he's disgruntled to find that, in fact, many of his professors are either indifferent toward Christianity and individualism, and some are even downright hostile. And so Buckley, using a couple of different platforms, one is the Yale Political Union. He was a formal debater in prep school, as a formal debater at Yale. He uses that role to advocate his conservative beliefs, but also in this role as chairman of the Yale Daily News, he editorializes not only about international politics and the Cold War, domestic politics. The election in 1948 happens when he's there, and that's a very interesting presidential election. Buckley comments on those, but he also comments on campus politics. Now, I don't want any of you students to get any ideas here, but he uses his editorial page to even write critiques of his professors, which is shocking and appalling, I'm sure. And so he'll write, if he finds that one of his professors has too much of a liberal bias, he will write an editorial about it and let the campus know why it's so unacceptable. After he graduates from Yale, the first thing he does is he sits down to write a book-length indictment of his alma mater. He writes a book called God and Man at Yale. And this is a book in which he elaborates this critique of the institution, not only of Yale itself, but of American higher education generally. And he says basically American higher education is marked by this paradox. Christian individualist parents send their children off to university only to have them converted into atheistic socialists. And so Buckley says what we need to do is get rid of the hoax of academic freedom. Academic freedom has some value in the area of research, Buckley argues, but it does not have a place in the area of teaching. Buckley says that universities, alumni, boards of trustees, administrations should play a much stronger role in who is hired on the faculty, who is fired on the faculty, and what is being taught. And so Buckley makes this very, very controversial argument. He's only, in his 20s when this book comes out, and the book is widely reviewed and it's mostly reviled. But Buckley proves to be impossible to ignore. He sort of stuck his thumb in the eye of the establishment from right there inside of the establishment. And so he sort of arrived on the intellectual scene as somebody who's going to be impossible to ignore. If that wasn't controversial enough, stepping on the third rail of higher ed by critiquing academic freedom, Buckley's next book was a book-length defense of Senator Joseph McCarthy. And McCarthy, of course, was most famous or infamous for leading the latest Red Scare in the country. McCarthy was somebody who was going after communists wherever he thought they might be, and of course he was subject to great criticism as a result of that pursuit. Many people called it a witch hunt. Buckley defends McCarthy. He defends McCarthy, and he says McCarthy is not a perfect instrument. He's sometimes guilty of exaggeration. He sometimes utilizes questionable tactics. But Buckley argues McCarthy is doing a great national service. He is trying to enforce what Buckley called a public orthodoxy. This is an idea he was taught by one of his few conservative professors at Yale, a guy named Wilmore Kendall, a very important political theorist, who taught Buckley that any sane society is a closed society. A sane society needs to have a certain orthodoxy that it tries to hold the populace to. And there's certain ideas that are beyond that, or if they're beyond that orthodoxy, they need to be discouraged, possibly even banned and punished if they're held. And so Buckley sees McCarthyism as a justified enterprise, and he is more than happy not only to write that book, but to go around the country speaking in defense of McCarthy, to go on television. This early, the early days of television, Buckley is sort of a proxy for McCarthy in many instances, where he's out there defending McCarthyism. So Buckley, that book, you can imagine, was also extraordinarily controversial, but he is out there on the scene as this kind of person who needs to be dealt with. Meanwhile, James Baldwin is getting his start as a writer right around the same time. So Baldwin leaves the United States in 1948. So Baldwin watches his father consumed by despair, ends up dying in a mental institution in 1943. Baldwin then watches one of his best friends, Eugene Wirth, this young idealist who he got to know through in Greenwich Village, and they got involved with various political causes together. He watches Eugene Wirth, also consumed by despair. Wirth commits suicide in 1946, and Baldwin sort of sees in his own life that could be his fate, right? He describes sort of the ways in which despair is creeping into his own life. He describes, perhaps most powerfully in one of his most famous essays, Notes of the Native Son, this experience he had in New Jersey. He's working in New Jersey during World War II, and he's being told constantly in New Jersey, we don't serve your kind here. And so Baldwin describes sitting in a restaurant and being told that, and it was sort of told that one too many times. And he stands up and he throws a glass at the server, and ends up, she ducks and ends up shattering a mirror behind her. And of course, the police are called, and there's people chasing Baldwin through the streets. And he says, what I realized that night was that not only was my own life in danger, but I realized that I was capable. My rage had reached an extent that I was capable of harming somebody else. So he says, in order to save myself, in order to really save my soul, I had to leave. And so he leaves the United States and lives and ends up settling in Paris, following a long line of African-American artists who settled in Paris to escape the cruelties of racism in the United States. And Baldwin, in Paris, is finally able to do what he's been trying to do for several years, which is to write an autobiographical novel. He'd been trying to write a novel that would capture the experiences of families like his own in Harlem. And so Baldwin does succeed in the next few years. He finishes that novel. It's called Go Tell on the Mountain. Go Tell It on the Mountain, and it's published in 1953. Baldwin is also writing a lot of book reviews in this era, utilizing the writing of others, critiquing the writing of others to try to figure out what it means to be an honest man and a good writer, and how those two things are related to each other. Baldwin writes his second novel, Giovanni's Room, which is about a love affair between a white American, a guy named David, who's traveling in Paris, and he falls in love with an Italian bartender named Giovanni. And many of the same people who work with Baldwin on Go Tell on the Mountain refused to work with him on Giovanni's Room. Imagine publishing a novel about a gay love affair in 1956. Many of those people who worked with him on Mountain said, we can't work with you on this. Why are you writing this? Why are you handing us what they call the quote-unquote all-white gay novel? And Baldwin's response to that question, I think, really reveals what he's up to in these early years. He says that really, if you think that Go Tell on the Mountain is about race, because it's about an African-American family in Harlem, or if you think Giovanni's Room is about sex, because it's about this love affair, you're missing the point. The point for Baldwin in this period and really throughout his life, the thing that most interests him is really the kind of nexus of three things: identity, morality, and power. Baldwin is really taken by this question. He's fascinated and obsessed with this question of identity. Who do we take ourselves to be as individuals? Who do we think we are, right? Who do we think we are as individuals, and who do we think we are as members of groups? And so Baldwin is really obsessed with that question, and the relationship between that question of identity, and a question of morality. How does who do we take ourselves to be lead us to treat other people? And then a third question, kind of related to the both of those two, is a question of power. Who has power? Who doesn't? How does power manifest itself in the world? How are our power relationships justified? And if not, what can we do to change them? Those are the questions that obsess Baldwin in this period and through the end of his life. And really the kind of central diagnosis that I want to share with you, just as by way of kind of introducing you to his thought for those who haven't read his works, the central diagnosis Baldwin gives us is that really most of us, most of the time, and really all of us all the time to some extent, are in a state of identity crisis. Baldwin says that what we try to do is we construct identities that make us feel safe, because fundamentally we're scared. That's the fundamental fact of human nature. So in some ways, he has this in common with, Thomas Hobbes, for those of you who are taking one of Professor Gross's classes in political thought. Baldwin says we're fundamentally scared. And so what we do is we construct identities that make us feel safe. And one of the really central ways we do that is we construct identities that make us feel superior to others, right? So he says, if you want to understand racism, if you want to understand homophobia, if you want to understand xenophobia, really the central fact you need to keep in mind is that human beings are scared. They're constructing identities that make them feel superior to other people because they think that will make them feel safe. Well, guess what? James Baldwin says that is a recipe for disaster. We all do it, but it's a recipe for disaster because we are constantly going to be racked by a kind of status anxiety, where we're going to be haunted by the fact, the fact in our minds that someone somewhere is feeling superior to us. And so that's the kind of diagnosis that Baldwin gives us in his early years, and you'll see how that diagnosis manifests itself so powerfully in his reflections on race and civil rights. All right, so if we fast forward just a little bit to the mid-1950s, I'm going to tell you a little bit about William F. Buckley as a kind of founding father of the conservative movement. But before I do that, I'm going to take a sip of water. So in the early 50s, Buckley has published these two books, and the books are actually quite successful. But he's frustrated, and he's frustrated because, and the academics in the audience, the authors in the audience can relate to this, he's frustrated by the glacial pace of book publishing. Writing a book takes a long time, and publishing a book takes a long time, even after you're done writing the thing. So Buckley, really what he wants to do is have an impact on day-to-day politics. And he recognizes that in American political history, magazines have played a really important role in American political development. So in particular, in the early 20th century, magazines like The Nation and The New Republic did so much to shape the American progressive movement. And so Buckley, what he wants to do is is form a magazine, found a magazine that will help him really create an American conservative movement. Because at that time, there was a lot of people on the American right, but you really couldn't identify a coherent movement. And the problem from Buckley's perspective was you had people on the right who really didn't get along. And so you had people like, Russell Kirk, traditionalists, who were especially concerned about the perceived decline of religion and morality in the West. You had people like that, and you also had people like Frank Meyer, who was a libertarian, a kind of libertarian who was especially worried about, the growth of the state and state intervention in economic affairs, what he viewed as excessive state intervention in economic affairs. And you also had people out there who were fundamentally on the right because of their anti-communist views. And Buckley says, although there's a lot of things about, that these folks disagree about, perhaps we can unite them together under the banner of this magazine and in other ways. We can unite together over what we oppose, right? So we might not agree on everything. He's never going to get Russell Kirk and Frank Meyer to really like each other. In fact, they really never did like each other. But they could agree that they dislike liberalism, they dislike communism, and so maybe they could figure out how to cooperate and kind of fuse their views together in various ways. And so Buckley founds this magazine, National Review, and the first issue is November 1955. And the magazine really plays an outsized role in the shaping of the American conservative movement. Buckley succeeded in recruiting writers to the magazine, recruiting editors to the magazine that didn't agree on everything, but they were able to provide what he hoped would be a kind of serious, intellectual, responsible brand of conservatism. So Buckley kind of plays this role as a sort of editor of conservatism. He's trying to be a kind of gatekeeper. Who's going to be invited in to this burgeoning conservative movement and who's going to be left out? So Buckley definitely ends up editing some people out of the movement, and that's an important part of this story, who he allows in and who he edits out. He edits Ayn Rand out, for example, and eventually he will edit out Robert Welch and members of the John Birch Society. That takes a little while. It's kind of a long story. But there's certain people that he thinks have views that are irresponsible for one reason or another, and so he edits them out. But he also edits a lot of people in, and that's really important to our to the story that I'm trying to tell in the book. As Buckley is founding National Review, think about the timing. So, or of course, we have the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision, and you have the immediate and growing backlash against that decision, in the American South. So you have the rise of the white citizens councils in the immediate aftermath of the Brown v. Board decision. Early 1955, you have the lynching of Emmett Till, which gets international headlines. Later in 1955, you have the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, of course, and the rise of this young 26-year-old minister, Martin Luther King. All that is happening right in 54, 55, right in the months that Buckley is fundraising for his new magazine, in which he's putting together his editorial team. So one of the big questions is, where is this magazine going to come down on questions of race and civil rights? And one of the things I like to remind audiences is it's not a foregone conclusion that someone founding a conservative magazine in 1955, that magazine will come down in a position of hostility and skepticism. A lot of people who thought of themselves as conservatives also thought of themselves as sympathetic to civil rights. So one of the sort of best examples I can give is the very first issue of National Review, the inaugural issue of National Review, November 1955, right? So Ben put all this thought into who's going to be the inaugural Tocqueville lecture, right? Who's the right person? It was me, lucky me. Buckley thinks, who's the right person to write the lead article in the inaugural issue of National Review, the sort of feature article? He chooses Senator William Nolan from California. Nolan was a conservative, for sure. He was actually somebody who Buckley hoped would primary President Dwight Eisenhower in the presidential election of 1956 from Eisenhower's right as a conservative. So Nolan was a conservative. Nolan also thought of himself as sympathetic to civil rights. So there were all sorts of people in the political sphere who thought of themselves as conservative and sympathetic to civil rights. Buckley chooses another course. And I argue in the book that although we can't, give Buckley too much credit, we should give him a great deal of credit for the kind of shaping of a conservative movement that has a big impact. The decisions he makes back in the mid-50s have an impact down to us today. And so Buckley, the sort of punchline here is that if you think about what Buckley was trying to do, what he says he was trying to do on race and civil rights, in those early years. He says in 1965, so marking the 10-year anniversary of National Review, he's asked by somebody writing a book about National Review at age 10, what was your approach on race and civil rights? And Buckley says, my philosophy was I wanted the magazine to be extremely articulate. That was always important to William F. Buckley. He wanted the magazine to be extremely articulate, non-racist, but not reflexively racially egalitarian. So those two things, right? So he thought there was a line that you could walk down that was not racist, but not necessarily racially egalitarian. And you'll see in a minute, how fine that line is. Now, Buckley, just to give you a sense of looking, starting where that leads to in terms of conclusions, and then we'll work our way back to the reasoning for a minute. Where that leads to in terms of conclusions is National Review is hostile. They make it very clear from the word go. They're against the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision, not just because they view it as a sort of act of judicial tyranny, not just for institutional reasons. They thought the court was getting involved in areas that they shouldn't be involved in, but they were against any federal intervention to combat segregation, any federal intervention. So they make it clear that even if the conclusion of Brown v. Board was reached by way of congressional act, that would be illegitimate from National Review's perspective. They are critics of Martin Luther King at just about every turn. The one exception is they believe economic boycotts are a legitimate form of social protest. That's one area where you can find some defenses of King in National Review. They're critics of the student sit-in movement. They're critics of the Freedom Ride movement. They are against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They are against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They are supportive of politicians like Strom Thurmond, pictured in the lower left of your screen, who's pointing at the clock behind him as a point of pride after he's delivered a 24-hour filibuster in opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which I'll talk about in a minute. The magazine also, a couple of the go-to guys on race are pictured here, so you can see in the bottom right of your screen Richard Weaver, a very important Southern agrarian writer. Weaver was somebody who had written these big philosophical books about all sorts of subjects. Most importantly for National Review, he really offers Buckley a very complex philosophical defense of everything his mother ever taught him about race. So Weaver is willing to say, yes, we believe in racial hierarchy, but we have a kind of benign, benevolent racial hierarchy. We believe in fruitful inequality. There is, a kind of noblesse oblige that's central to what Weber calls the regime of the South. Buckley also enlists this. James Jackson Kilpatrick is in the upper left of your screen. Kilpatrick is really Buckley's go-to guy on race. He is the sort of reporter and writer that Buckley turns to more often than not. He sends Kilpatrick down, for example, to Arkansas during the crisis at Little Rock in 1957. Kilpatrick is a newspaper editor in his own right in Virginia. He is known as the kind of squire of massive resistance. Kilpatrick had devoted his professional life to being, as his biographer calls him, the leading salesman for segregation. So when there's a moment when segregation needed to be defended on television, if you're looking for somebody to debate Martin Luther King, for example, they invited Mr. Kilpatrick. Buckley returns to him again and again on race and civil rights. Buckley even cozies up with folks like William J. Simmons, who's pictured in the upper right of your screen. Simmons was one of the founding fathers of the White Citizens Council movement. Buckley figures out late in the 50s that he and Simmons can be mutually beneficial to each other. And so Buckley begins working with Simmons behind the scenes. And the White Citizens Council movement was, I think, aptly described by journalists at the time, by civil rights activists like Bayard Rustin, as the Uptown Klan. Same values, different outfits. They were essentially ruining people's lives if they viewed those using different tactics than the Klan, if they viewed those folks to be too sympathetic to civil rights. And so Buckley's cozying up with even people like William J. Simmons. And Buckley's own views come through loud and clear in 1957. So he's commissioning all these sorts of writers for the magazine. The magazine's editorial position is abundantly clear. But Buckley's own views come through loud and clear in 1957 when he authors a piece known as Why the South Must Prevail. And this is a piece that is the proximate cause for it was the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the one that Thurman filibustered for over 24 hours. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is a piece of legislation we don't tend to talk about very much anymore because it was essentially hollowed out of most of its meaning through the unfriendly amendments of many Southern Democrats. So Thurman and his allies, Richard Russell and others, they included amendments in the bill that essentially made it a toothless bill. And the central thing that they did, the most important thing that they did, was they included a clause that said any accusation of violation of the civil rights of African Americans, that any sort of case would be considered by juries and not by federal judges. And so what that was essentially a jury nullification clause. The people who included that amendment knew that meant that no one was going to be convicted of anything, right? No one would be convicted by these all-white juries in the South at the time of violating the civil rights of anyone. So it's really a jury nullification clause built into the law. And so Buckley writes Why the South Must Prevail to defend that clause in particular. And what he says, among other things, and I like to show the quote from my first slide here because it's a quote from that piece. The white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally because for the time being it is the advanced race. So Buckley takes an explicitly white supremacist position in that piece, but again he says it's not a white supremacist position that's rooted in animus. He says I am taking this position because the white South has to take this position because they are the defenders of civilization, is the way Buckley puts it in the piece. And he calls on the white South to also kind of practice that kind of noblesse oblige I described earlier. He says that it is incumbent on the white South not to abuse this power. They should try to bring about an eventual cultural equality. So I say that, if one of the slogans of the civil rights movement was freedom now, William F. Buckley Jr.'s slogan for the civil rights movement was something like some freedom one day when we decide you're ready. That's kind of the way Buckley thought about these issues. So Buckley gets some pushback from within his own magazine for taking that view. Not much pushback, but pushback from one person in particular, a guy named L. Brent Bozell, who was Buckley's brother-in-law. He was his Yale debate partner, and he was his co-author of the McCarthy book. Bozell was extremely conservative. It's important to know this about Bozell. He actually ended up, in some ways, ending up far to the right of William F. Buckley, and moving to Spain because he was quite attracted to Francisco Franco. But that's a whole nother story. But Bozell pushes back against Buckley's "Why the South Must Prevail" piece because Bozell is a lawyer. And he says to Buckley, hey, we're conservatives. Don't we care about the rule of law? Don't we care about the Constitution? One of the things the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is trying to do is protect the voting rights, the 15th Amendment. And Buckley has this very interesting response. He says, well, the 15th Amendment isn't quite the same as the rest of the Constitution. It's a Civil War amendment. And so he ends up emphasizing the 14th and 15th Amendments. And he says, those are viewed by much of the South, Buckley says, as inorganic accretions. That's Buckley with his fancy vocab. Inorganic accretions on the original document that were simply grafted onto the original document by victors at war. And so this Bozell, this is a response that Buckley offers to Bozell. Of course, one of the questions I ask in the book is, where does that leave the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery? I don't know. Buckley doesn't tell us, but the logic seems to be a little bit dubious. So Buckley is going back and forth about these things, and it's right at this exact moment. And this was the most powerful moment for me as a writer. Was I do this really deep dive into Buckley and his world and how they're justifying their resistance to the Civil Rights Revolution. I really try in the book to be as fair as I can to Buckley and his crew, to let them speak for themselves, to really try to get inside their heads and try to understand the world as they saw it. Right in that same period, when Buckley is going back and forth about just how far they ought to go, late summer 1957, James Baldwin is returning to the United States. When the primary purpose he's returning is to go down to the South to bear witness to what's happening there. So Baldwin, I go from this moment where I do this 20 pages or so of Buckley and his crew rationalizing and justifying their resistance to civil rights, to James Baldwin sitting in the living room of a 15-year-old kid who was the first black student in a previously all-white high school in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Baldwin, as he's sitting there with this young man, and the young man's mother is in the room as well, Baldwin wants to try to understand what the world looks like through this young man's eyes. He wants to try to get a sense of what it's like for this young man to, what it was like for him on his second day of school to be walking toward his new school and to see in front of the doors of the school a human barricade made up of his white classmates who are arm in arm, trying to keep him out. He wants to know what it's like for this young man to be experiencing physical and verbal assaults on a regular basis in this new school. And Baldwin really wants to try to understand. One of the things he says most powerfully in the piece is he says, I want to know how this young man, this 15-year-old kid, faces what is undoubtedly the most difficult moment in his day. The moment when he wakes up and opens his eyes and realizes it all has to be gone through again. So Baldwin, this is the kind of thing Baldwin was doing. In his fiction, he does this with his characters. In his nonfiction, he does this with the folks that he's writing about. He really wants to try to get us inside of the heads of these people and see what the world might look like. And so not only this young man, but he's very interested in talking to this young man's mother. And this young man's mother, is one of only a few dozen African-American parents in the city of Charlotte, which had over 50,000 African-American people at the time, one of only a few dozen parents who even applied for this integration program. And so Baldwin wants to try to understand how, what resources did she have, emotionally, spiritually, to be able to have the courage to put what little she had on the line so that her child could get a better education than he had been getting. And so Baldwin wants to try to understand the world through her eyes. And one of the things that's important to know about Baldwin, as the youngest of 9 children, Baldwin often thought of himself as a kind of quasi-parent. And so one of the things that always haunted him, he describes really powerfully in one of his most famous pieces, Notes of a Native Son. He describes looking around this Harlem church in 1943 at his father's funeral. And he's looking around at all these parents. And he says, I'm haunted by this impossibility, is the term he uses, the impossibility that all these parents face. And the impossibility they face is, how do they equip their children? What kind of armor can they create for their children that will protect them from the hostile world around them? And Baldwin says the thing that absolutely is devastating is that every one of these parents knows that there is no armor that they can possibly create that is strong enough to protect their children from that world. And Baldwin says there's nothing more terrifying for us as individuals, and all of us, I think, can relate to this on some level. There's nothing more terrifying than seeing someone you love in peril and knowing that there's nothing you can do to keep them safe. And so Baldwin wants to try to get us to see the world through the eyes of this young man's parents. He also wants to get us to see the world through the eyes of the white principal of that school. So Baldwin goes from meeting with this young man, Gus, and his mother to the school to sit down and talk with this white principal of the school, this young man. And Baldwin says, earlier in my life, I would have been walking in that room ready for a fist fight. But he says, I really wanted to try to understand how this young principal saw the world. And he says, I found myself actually rather liking him. I thought he seemed like a gentle person and even an honorable person. But he said, I also sensed that he was a delusional person. And that delusion in some ways wasn't his fault. Baldwin says everything this man had ever been taught him to think that what was happening in his school, Gus's presence in his school, this one African-American student, an otherwise all-white school, that was wrong. Everything this man had been taught led him to believe that. And so Baldwin says that this principal was confronted by an impossibility. He uses that same word that he used to describe those parents in the Harlem church. He says this principal was confronted by an impossibility. How can he bridge the gap between everything he's ever been taught and this role that he is now required by law to play? Baldwin recognizes that this young white principal's world has been turned completely upside down. So how can he confront that impossibility? And he says to the principal at the end of their conversation, he says, what I want to say to you, sir, is that it must be very difficult for you to play the role that you've been asked to play, because in some ways you are no more responsible for it than this young man who's now attending your school. And Baldwin says in that moment, he saw something that he had not previously seen in this principal's face, this kind of moment of recognition that was sort of not there before. And that's the kind of thing that Baldwin is doing in this period. He's trying to write about this drama unfolding in the South from the inside. He's trying to give us a sense of what the world looks like through the eyes of all these people who are on the front lines of this struggle in one way or another. Now, what I'm going to do now is there's so much that happens in the early, and once I get talking about this story, I get carried away. So I know I've talked for a long time, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation. So I promise to wrap up in just a moment. But what I want to highlight here, and this could be a basis for possible questions or things you want to discuss in the Q&A, is that, really in the the early 60s, so much is happening both on both sides of this story, both the rise of the conservative movement, the rise of Barry Goldwater, for example, and on the civil rights side of the story, the March on Washington, the Birmingham campaign, the rise of George Wallace, and so on. All that's happening. And Buckley and Baldwin are right there at the eye of the storm. And one of the things that was so valuable to me as a writer as I'm trying to tell this story is that Baldwin and Buckley were so prolific. I mean, they both published so much. And not only did they publish so much, but they both have these vast archives. So I was able to, one of the things we do when we study history is we read dead people's mail. And so I'm reading these letters that Baldwin and Buckley are writing to the people in their lives. And so I'm really able to get a glimpse into their heads each and every day as they're not only witnessing, but really shaping this history that I'm writing about. And so they are there in so many ways, kind of reacting to things happening around them, shaping things that are happening around them. So in that period, there's so much. And if there's particular moments in that period that you'd like to discuss, please feel free to ask me about them in the Q&A. I'd be happy to expand about them. And I'll just expand on any of those major moments. And I'll just say very, very briefly that one of the things that's happening in this period that's important to setting up the debate is that Buckley is one of the great champions of the Barry Goldwater candidacy for president. So Barry Goldwater is the Republican nominee in 1964. Goldwater on questions of race and civil rights is a kind of really complicated and interesting story. But for the most important thing, the central thing that people knew about Goldwater and civil rights for the purposes of the election was that he had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And for that reason, among others, Goldwater was crucial, this crucial symbol in a shift in American politics. The formerly solidly Democratic South, the Deep South especially, he shifts to what Kilpatrick, Buckley's colleague, called Goldwater country, and has remained so ever since in most ways. And so that is a really important part of the story. So part of what I try to capture is Buckley's role in all that, and how Buckley adapts his racial politics to the sort of, as he's losing many battles in the Civil Rights Revolution, Buckley recognizes he's going to have to adapt his racial politics to win the war for the American soul. And so that's part of the story that I tell in the book, is how Buckley loses many battles, but in some ways he wins the war. Baldwin, for his part, is continuing to do the work that I described earlier, but he's also really kind of engaging as a kind of activist of a kind. He does not like being called an activist. He thinks of himself primarily as an artist, primarily as a writer, but he is called into action, so to speak, in a variety of different ways, as a civil rights speaker, as an advocate for various positions in the civil rights struggle. He engages in debates with, among others, James Jackson Kilpatrick, that leading salesman for segregation in late 1962. Baldwin sits across the table from him, and I'd love to tell you about that in the Q&A if you'd like. So Baldwin is engaged in this struggle. So now if we fast forward to February 1965, we're still in the midst of the Civil Rights Revolution, right? That phase in the Civil Rights Revolution. We're in the midst of the Selma campaign for voting rights. The same night that Baldwin and Buckley square off at Cambridge is the night of the famous protest in Marion, Alabama. I don't know how far Marion is from where all of you are, but Marion, of course, that scene is so famously depicted in Ava DuVernay's film Selma. It's the night where a small group of protesters marched from their church their plan was to march to the jail to protest the arrest of one of their leaders, and they kneel to pray when they're confronted by law enforcement, and they are brutalized by that group of law enforcement officers. And Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old church deacon, is murdered that night by an Alabama law enforcement officer. So that happens the same night Baldwin and Buckley are debating. And so Baldwin and Buckley are there, and I can tell you the backstory of how they got there that night in the Q&A if you'd like. They're invited there for various reasons to debate on this international stage that motion that I described at the outset of my talk. The American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. So Baldwin was there to propose that motion, and Buckley was there to oppose that motion. And so what I'm going to do now is just play a couple of short clips from the debate. And Ben and I checked out the technology, and it seems to work okay. So I'm going to play just a short clip about 2 or 3 minutes from Baldwin, and then 2 or 3 minutes from Buckley, and then I'll wrap up, and we'll have time for conversation. So here's a little bit of James Baldwin. So 2 students speak before Baldwin gets up there. It's a student debating society primarily. And so 2 students speak, 1 on each side, and then Baldwin gets up to speak. So here's a little bit of James Baldwin.
You suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end.
Okay, so that gives you just a little bit of a sense of what Baldwin did there that night. And I won't say too much about this, but I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of the themes, the major themes of Baldwin's speech. Baldwin says right when he gets up that he says, I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah. And that, of course, is announcing to his audience that he is there to deliver a sermon, and a particular kind of sermon at that. He is there to deliver this sermon about white supremacy. And one of the things that's really important to highlight in Baldwin's speech is that sermon he talks about, as you just saw in the clip, that what he calls the impact of white supremacy on the category he calls the subjugated, right? The obvious victims of white supremacy, and the ways in which the sort of dignity of human beings is attacked by this system. But he also talks about the ways in which the sort of would-be beneficiaries of white supremacy are also its victims. So the subjugators, Baldwin says, are also victims of white supremacy. And the example he gives in the speech is among the most powerful you could give in that moment. He talks about Sheriff Jim Clark from Selma, Alabama, and he says, Sheriff Clark, it's easy to dismiss Sheriff Clark as a monster, but he's not a monster. He's a human being. Baldwin says he probably loves his wife and his children, and he probably likes to get drunk. The college students chuckle when Baldwin says that. It's one of the few moments of levity in his speech. And what Baldwin says about Clark is he says, think about the moral life of Jim Clark. Jim Clark, his entire sense of self is bound up in this delusion of white supremacy, this idea that his whiteness is the source of his value in the world. And Baldwin says his entire sense of his role in the world is bound up with this idea of white supremacy and that he is a guardian of it. Baldwin says there is nothing that could be more sad and pathetic than that. Baldwin says he doesn't like the phrase Black liberation. He says this is a struggle for the liberation of each and every one of us. It is a struggle, in a sense, for the liberation of Jim Clark. And if there's no hope for saving Jim Clark, Baldwin says, then we have to, as human beings, have hope that we perhaps can save Jim Clark's children. And so that's the kind of one of the themes of Baldwin's speech. There's a bunch of other themes there, and we can talk about them more in the Q&A if you'd like. I definitely would recommend to everybody that they go on YouTube after the talk, if you haven't already, and watch the Buckley-Baldwin debate, because it's remarkable in many ways. So Baldwin gives this speech. He speaks for 24 minutes, and then he sits down. He gets a standing ovation, which is a very, very rare thing at the Cambridge Union. And then Buckley has his opportunity to get up to speak. Now, Buckley says, as he writes about the debate later in life, I knew it wasn't going to be my night. And there were a couple reasons Buckley knew that to be the case. First of all, when the student on Buckley's side spoke to the audience, it was clear from the audience reaction that the general sense of the room was hostile to Buckley's position. And then also, Buckley saw that Baldwin had just gotten a standing ovation. Now, interestingly, Buckley's memory played tricks on him almost right away. Almost immediately after the debate, Buckley misremembered what actually happened. Buckley remembered Baldwin not only getting a standing ovation at the end of his speech, Buckley, in his recollection, remembered Baldwin getting a standing ovation before he even spoke. That Baldwin got a standing ovation before he uttered a word. That's not true. We have the video evidence. We can do the instant replay. But Buckley remembered it that way, which I think is important in terms of Buckley's sense of how hostile the room was that night. So here's a little bit of William F. Buckley, and then we'll chat.
Quite properly, commands the contempt which he so eloquently showers upon us. It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders, is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals, that our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast.
Okay, so there's a little bit of William Buckley there, and there's, Buckley actually delivers a longer speech. It's 29 minutes, so you can see most of it in the YouTube recording. Some of Buckley's speech was edited out by the BBC, so there's more to Buckley's speech than you're able to see on the BBC recording. But Buckley gives this speech, and for those of you who have never seen Buckley in action before, and if you're intrigued, whether you like his views or you don't like his views, you just like to hear him talk, there's hours and hours of YouTube pleasure in your future, because Buckley did a lot of talking, and a lot of it's on YouTube. So Buckley delivers this speech, and one of the central themes is captured in the clip I just played. So one of the things he does is he tries to situate Baldwin as this dangerous radical hell-bent on overthrowing Western civilization. So he says, basically, if you go with Baldwin, you are agreeing to raid the libraries around here and tear up, burn all the Plato and the Aristotle, tear up the Bibles, and tear up the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so on. So that's one of the things he does, is try to sort of paint Baldwin as this dangerous radical hell-bent on overthrowing Western civilization and the American constitutional system and so on. But he also has other elements of his argument that I think are worth highlighting. One that I'll just give you that I think is really important is toward the end of the speech, Buckley offers his diagnosis of the situation, of the quote-unquote Negro problem, as he calls it. He says that the race problem in the United States is the subject of what he calls an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. He says on the one side, one of the sort of sides of the conjunction is there are individual racists out there who need to be convinced that they shouldn't be racist anymore. And so this is he uses that phrase, individual racists. And there's a couple things that are interesting about this. One is that phrase, individual racist, is in part, Buckley makes a kind of bad apples sort of argument. He says, look, racism in the United States is not a systemic problem. It's not a structural problem. There are some people out there who are racist, and they need to be convinced morally, Buckley says, not through the law, but morally, they need to be convinced that they shouldn't be racist anymore. Now, the other thing worth noting about that is Buckley is defining racism in a narrow way, right? He's saying that those who he's defining as racist are those who are animated by animus, right? That's always going back to his childhood. He is taught that to be racist is to be somebody who is animated by racial animus. And so all the things he had been doing in resisting the civil rights over the years, that is excluded from this category of racism. So it's one of the things we can talk about, is whether or not that's a legitimate exclusion. So the other side of the conjunction, the individual racists on this side, Buckley says also the other source of racial problems in the United States is what he calls the failures of the Negro community. That's an exact quote from William F. Buckley. So you have individual racists over here, the Negro community over here. That's not a mistake. Buckley is trying, what he tries to do in that part of the speech is to say, it's not just the fault of individual racists. He says it's also the fault of the quote-unquote Negro community, which has failed to take advantage of the opportunities that currently exist. That's what Buckley argues, and he calls on Baldwin. He says, Baldwin, you would be more responsible as a leader if you encourage, quote-unquote, your people to take advantage of the opportunities that exist. So that's part of Buckley's argument. And of course, I highlight that in part because that sort of argument, right, is we might as well, we could turn on cable news right now and we would hear almost the exact same rhetoric, the exact same discourse today. And so that's central to Buckley's argument then, and it's central to the way we talk about these things today in many instances. So I will wrap up with this, and that is I'm going to skip that one. There we go. So I just want to say before we go to the Q&A that Baldwin and Buckley have another encounter a few months later on American television on the television show of a guy named David Susskind, who's pictured here, who had this show called Open End. And it was called Open End because it was the last thing on at night. There were only 4 channels in those days, so they called it Open End because they could just go on forever as long as the people kept talking and they didn't pass out. They could just keep on talking. Buckley and Baldwin talked for 2 hours and continued their debate, as it were. And a lot of other things happened in the aftermath of the debate that are really important. Malcolm X is assassinated 3 days after the debate. The Bloody Sunday March happens 2.5 weeks after the debate. William F. Buckley ends up running for mayor of New York City just a few months after the debate. And the thing I'll end with is this. Baldwin and Buckley both reflect on the night they engaged each other at Cambridge and the encounter they had a few months later in New York. And I think their sort of reflections on their encounters are really telling. And so I'll conclude with them. Buckley says that the debate with Baldwin at Cambridge was the debate that he lost by the largest margin of any debate he ever had. But it was the debate for which he had the most pride. And so when he said this, the person interviewing him, Gary Wills, said, well, tell me more. Why are you so proud of your performance that night? And Buckley says, because I didn't give them 1 goddamn inch. And that's a quote from William F. Buckley, so I apologize if I offend anybody with that language. I used that language on PBS a few months ago, and I was bleeped on PBS. My mom was so disappointed. But that's what Buckley said. I didn't give them 1 goddamn inch. There's something about that intransigence, that pride in intransigence, which really captures Buckley's conservative creed and his reaction to the civil rights movement. On the other side, Baldwin is asked by an interviewer in the same year, 1968, what is your, tell me more about your feelings about your encounters with William F. Buckley Jr. And Baldwin actually doesn't say much about the encounter at Cambridge, this moment which he was triumphant. I should say that Baldwin was indeed triumphant by an actual formal vote. Baldwin's side got 544 votes. Buckley's side got 164 votes. So Baldwin was triumphant. But Baldwin, when he's asked that question, he really reflects on this encounter he had with Buckley a few months later on Open End. And by almost every account, the encounter on Open End was Buckley's night. Buckley got the better of Baldwin for a variety of different reasons we can talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. And when Baldwin reflects on why Buckley got the better of him that night, he says, Buckley succeeded in getting under my skin. He succeeded in a way that I just could not engage him that night. And he says, Buckley said something that night, and the particular thing that Buckley said was for Baldwin's ears, more or less, Baldwin heard Buckley say that the folks in Harlem, we're talking about Harlem, the folks in Harlem, the folks who are at the margins of the margins, deserve their fate. That's what Baldwin heard Buckley saying, and I can tell you more about the precise thing that Buckley said that really set Baldwin off. And so Baldwin said, I realized at that point there was nothing I could say to William F. Buckley that would possibly make a difference. And so Baldwin says, if I had it to do it all over again, I would have hit him over the head with my coffee cup. Now, that was a joke that Baldwin made that was a joke that had a very serious point at its core. Baldwin says that, he says this in the Cambridge speech, he says, what concerns me most is that we will be so unable to listen to each other, so unwilling to hear each other, that reason itself, discourse itself will lose its authority, and where reason ends, war begins. And Baldwin says, when that happens, it will be a very grave day for the West. That's how he ends his speech at Cambridge. And that line, right, has so much resonance in where we are today. And so that's why I care so much about this story. That's why I talked way too long, and I will shut up now and we'll have some time for conversation. So thank you for your attention.
Nick, no, thank you. And I wish we could be all together where you could hear the applause, because I am sure I've been getting messages from people who are watching, and they are loving it. I can't promise that this is going viral, but it's definitely been, and we have fabulous questions too. And so please, if you have questions, please keep sending them in. I'll bring some of these questions out, but by no means do we have to turn off the questions. So let me start here, maybe Nick, because it starts with an idea of just saying a very simple question. So a very simple question. Was Buckley influenced by Rand and her objectivist philosophy?
Yeah, so that's a long story, but I will keep it relatively short. And Ben and I talked about this beforehand. We are as long as this thing goes on, we're free of our daddy duties. So we can, we're going to miss bedtime, and so we both have egalitarian households. We should say that, but we also appreciate moments like this, so we can talk. It can be open end Jacksonville State version. So Buckley and Rand have a really interesting relationship in the sense that Rand is, of course, she's arriving, on the scene in the same period that I was describing, and obviously having this huge impact. And Buckley and Rand meet each other in the 50s, and they're kind of running in some of the same circles. And one of the great stories Buckley tells about meeting Ayn Rand is, Rand, the first thing she says to him, and he did this, kind of Russian accent as part of his shtick on this. He says, the first thing Ayn Rand said to me is, Mr. Buckley, a man as intelligent as, how can a man as intelligent as you believe in God? And so Rand, of course, famously atheist, Buckley famously theist. And so the relationship got off to a little bit of a rocky start, we might say. And so one of the things that Buckley does is he commissions Whittaker Chambers, this other giant on the American right in that era, this really important anti-communist figure who'd written another really important text in the early conservative movement, this text Witness. He commissions Chambers to write a review of Atlas Shrugged in 1957, and it is like about as scathing and brutal a review as you can imagine. So Rand, from that point forward, refuses to ever be in the same room with William F. Buckley. So she's invited to a cocktail party in New York. Her first question was always, is William F. Buckley Jr. going to be there? And if the answer was yes, she refused to attend. So they had some hostility. And I would say the central, point of hostility between the two of them was this question of the belief in God. Although there are ways in which, on the question of objectivism, Buckley called himself an individualist. He sometimes called himself a libertarian, but he also, I think, thought that Rand took individualism a little bit too far, in the sense that Buckley would often argue that while he was an individualist politically, he saw room for a kind of more robust, understanding of charity than objectivism could provide. And so that was kind of Buckley's read. I'm not saying he was right or wrong about objectivism, but that's what I would say about that relationship. Excellent,
wonderful. Another question we have here is, would you say that Baldwin believed the white man, or I think it should be why would you say, or what would you say made Baldwin believe that the white man was scared of the Negro man? What was the fear there that he thought was there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that was really, I think, central to Baldwin's racial politics, his philosophy. And it's not necessarily, I don't think his answer is as obvious as one might think. There's a lot going on here. Some of it has to do with economics, some of it has to do with sex, some of it has to do with politics, but Baldwin, and so all those things are important, and we can elaborate on those things if we'd like. So there's definitely a story to tell on each of those strands. But one of the things I think is really powerful about Baldwin, and what he thought was most frightening to those resisting Black liberation, for lack of a better term, is, and I think he puts this so beautifully in that debate I mentioned the with Kilpatrick, is that Baldwin says that in order to survive, he says, Black people, those who have been, defined as Black by the society, have had to watch white people very closely. Those who are accepted as white, very, very closely. In order to survive, we've had to watch you very closely, Baldwin says to Kilpatrick. Whereas you've been in a position where you've hardly had to notice that we're here, right? We're here to serve you, right? That's what you know about us, right? So Baldwin would often say, I've been in the kitchens of, my white classmates. He said, I've been in the kitchens of my white classmates when I was in high school, at DeWitt Clinton High School. I went to their kitchens and I got to see their families and so on. My white friends weren't in my kitchen. They have no idea. And then when my mother, as she's going uptown to work, or going downtown to work in the kitchens of the, of white families, they know next to nothing about her. and she knows everything about them. The way Baldwin would put this by way of metaphor was, he says, my mother knows when your drawers are dirty. And so Baldwin says what's so frightening about the idea of Black liberation, Baldwin says, is that the idea of Black people being liberated is the threat of being able to tell the story of all that we have seen. And so Baldwin says that's what scares people more than anything else. And so I think there's a lot going on there, right? We could go on about that. But that's something that Baldwin says I think is kind of maybe unique to in terms of how we think about these things. It's worth thinking about. Whether or not Baldwin's right or wrong, I think it's definitely worth thinking about.
No, absolutely wonderful. And then this is another question, I think, that pairs sort of well where we just left off there. We have a question here from Bronson. Do you think Baldwin's concept of identity construction has made a splash in American culture today, especially since equality has come a long way since his lifetime?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, Bronson. It's a really good one. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that was fascinating to think about, as I worked on this book, is because, of course, we are, discussing in all sorts of ways this concept of, quote unquote, identity politics. And so to have James Baldwin is somebody, who I was, spending all this time with, who's obsessed with, this question of identity, or as he sometimes called it, the grave questions of self. Was really fascinating for me as just in terms of kind of my own understanding of the world. And so this is one of the things that I think there's arguments back and forth. So Baldwin is this really important figure in thinking about identity. He's somebody who is also having a moment in our culture in a lot of ways. Baldwin, for a variety of reasons, Baldwin lives until 1987. For a variety of reasons, his kind of influence in the culture wanes a little bit in the period after the debate. But in the last few years, he's kind of risen. In terms of a lot more people are sort of getting to know James Baldwin through the film that was made, the documentary that was nominated for an Academy Award, I'm Not Your Negro, which everyone should check out. Raoul Peck's a really excellent film. And then If Beale Street Could Talk, one of Baldwin's novels, was adapted into a film that came out a couple years ago, which also is wonderful. So there's also, but philosophically, right? The question is, what is it about? Has Baldwin's idea kind of can we see it manifesting itself in the world around us? And one of the things I think is my answer to that is kind of yes and no. I think that the kinds of questions of identity that sort of fascinated Baldwin, we can see them manifesting themselves, not only in sort of academia, but also in the broader culture, and sort of reflecting on the construction of our identities and ways in which those constructions are rooted or sort of on these very shaky foundations and so on. I think we can see that and sort of in some ways, trace it back to Baldwin and other thinkers of his generation. But the other thing I like to point out to people is there are a lot of things Baldwin has to say about identity that might be kind of out of step with where we are today. And that's one of the things I think is most fascinating about him, is that Baldwin, he's engaging in these sorts of debates not only with figures like James Jackson Kilpatrick and William F. Buckley, he's also having debates with people like Malcolm X. And he thought of Malcolm X as a friend and an ally in a lot of ways, but they also disagreed about a lot. And one of the things they disagreed about was identity. And so the other thing everyone should check out is go online after the talk or tomorrow morning and check out the conversations, the recordings, the audio recordings that we still have of Baldwin having back and forth discussions with Malcolm X, because one of the central issues between Malcolm and Baldwin is a question of how do we construct an affirmative identity in which we can love ourselves, which Baldwin thinks is crucial to the story, but at the same time find room to love other people who are different from us, right? And so Baldwin has this radical idea, he calls it a reckless idea in one of his conversations with Malcolm, of can we construct an identity for ourselves that doesn't require an enemy? That's a radical idea. And of course, that's an idea that would be, if we could achieve that, right, then, and Baldwin doesn't think ultimately one fine day we can do that. He thinks that struggle goes on each and every day. And so, think about that. What would it mean for each of us to construct our identity each day in a way that doesn't require an enemy? That seems very hard to imagine right now in this moment politically. But Baldwin, he wants us to imagine that and think about what that might look like.
That led to a question that I had too, and I'll refrain because we have so many good questions. But I think you're right. That's a great question about what would an identity look like, where someone doesn't have to be an enemy. That's a wonderful. So I'll keep. We've had a lot of discussion of Buckley's ideology, but what was Baldwin's ideology? Was asked. What ideology did Baldwin have?
Yeah, great question. And Baldwin is notoriously difficult to categorize. I mean, he's somebody who Baldwin, he says very early on in his writings, he writes this little kind of autobiographical introduction to his first essay collection. Notes of, the collection's called he's called Notes of a Native Son, right? Is the collection, and the title essay is one I mentioned earlier. And in that collection, he writes his autobiographical notes, and he says at the conclusion, basically, I think all theories are suspect. That's a quote. All theories are suspect, and any theory that we hold to, we have to be prepared that theory will be pulverized by our experience. And so Baldwin describes, in his teenage years, he was he's sort of involved in the Young People's Socialist League. And he says, I was involved only long enough to learn that it was impossible to indoctrinate me. So he ends up leaving. He says, my life on the left, sort of the organized left, is of little interest because I left so quickly. I left the left so quickly. But Baldwin is definitely, so ideologically, he doesn't like to be categorized. There's things later in life, so Buckley is repeatedly trying to categorize him as, identifying with one ideology or another. But Baldwin is very reluctant to embrace ideologies because he thinks that ideologies are often substitutes for thinking. And so Baldwin, we can find moments with Baldwin in the early 70s, for example. He does, finally, after years of resisting the label, he does say that he thinks that there are sufficient problems with American capitalism that we need to come up with a kind of what he calls a Yankee Doodle brand of socialism, right? So there's all sorts of socialisms that wouldn't work, but he sort of identifies this this concept that Huey Newton described as Yankee Doodle socialism. So Baldwin ideologically is very difficult to pin down. I should also mention that sort of resistance to category is something that goes back to Baldwin's earliest writings. He thought that categorization was sort of dangerous, and often he says that categorization can lead to a kind of tendency in which ideas matter to us more than people. And Baldwin, so his central idea was sort of a deep kind of humanism, I think, more than anything else. And that applied also, I should say, this defiance of categorization to Baldwin's sexuality, which I mentioned, obliquely earlier in the talk. Baldwin was, so people would try to categorize him as a gay writer. And he was often asked, what his sexual identity was, and he often, the line I really loved that Baldwin used was that, he said that, I don't want to be categorized, but my philosophy is love is where you find it. And so he would often say that, which is this kind of a whole other part of his own experience in the world that I think is really important for us to think about. So yeah, I could go on about that, but I'll stop there so we get to more questions.
Absolutely, no, it's great. Sort of building off, I guess, where we're at, we have a question from Tanner who asks, was Baldwin's idea of identity influenced by the ideas of Jacques Lacan? And beyond that, was his idea, as I guess, of identity influenced by any other philosophers or writers?
Wow, man, you're doing some deep reading over there at Jacksonville State. So yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I mean, and Baldwin is one of these figures who, he does write a lot about other writers, so that it is a kind of useful way for us to try to make sense of the kind of influences on him. But he's not necessarily going to be, provide us with, a kind of, built out, theory of here's what, the kind of philosophical influences that inform my theory of identity. So it's always challenging when trying to sort of write about Baldwin, understand Baldwin, who are the central, kind of influences besides the ones he, explicitly identifies in some of his writings. So yeah, I don't have a good answer to the Lacan question, but certainly, Baldwin was somebody. I mean, one thing I think is useful, just by way of a kind of general answer to the question, is that Baldwin is somebody who, as I mentioned before, was from a very early age, was sort of reading everything. And so, and down to, even like to his deathbed, his biographer, David Leeming, describes, Baldwin in the south of France, losing, by the day, his body is deteriorating as a result of cancer. And he is still asking, Leeming, who's there to help him in that period, along with several others, he's asking him to pull books from the shelf, that he's read 100 times. And he's like, I want to look at this passage and think about what is, and so so there's something about Baldwin he's constantly, fascinated by a lot of thinkers, including, I should mention, Freud. And Freud's somebody who influences Baldwin, and he writes, he mentions Freud a number of times in his writings, and that idea I mentioned before of imagining an identity that without an enemy. I don't know if this came directly from Freud, but I always think of that line from Civilization and Its Discontents, when Freud says it's always possible to bind a group of people together in love, so long as there's people left for them to hate, right? That's something to that effect. And I feel like that's, that's part of that Baldwinian idea I described earlier. So great question.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Jacob asked, what was the view of Baldwin on religion, especially of Islam and Christianity, and its historical and social implications on African Americans?
Yeah, another great question. So yeah, the story of Baldwin and religion is a fascinating and difficult one. In the sense that Baldwin, as I said before, was raised in the Harlem storefront churches, and he's somebody who is who is always in the course of his life, although he leaves the church, he in many ways remains, a seeker of a sort. And one of the things he says at one point later in his life, and it was soon after the Buckley-Baldwin debate, is he's asked, what his religious views are, and he says, I'm an unorthodox Christian. And I think part of what he was getting at there was that he thought of Christianity as something that was still always, sort of a part of his life and his worldview, and inescapably a part of his worldview. Whenever he was asked for his influences, he was always would identify the King James Bible as the central text, and it always would be. And he always spoke in this kind of biblical language. The language of the Black Church was always there, and so there's a sense in which Baldwin, thought of himself as a kind of man of faith, till the end, while at the same time resisting, kind of labels, as I said before, and also resisting, a kind of organized religion in a variety of ways. I mean, Baldwin says in 1968 that, he thinks of the person of Jesus Christ as being the most betrayed man in history. And really, one of the things I direct people to who are interested in this question is in 1968, Baldwin delivers the keynote address to the World Council of Churches. And one of the things about that speech, it's a really fascinating, speech in which you can actually listen to it online. He's reflecting on his own religious views, and the historical context of the speech is important because Baldwin is delivering that speech. He's there because the keynote speaker was supposed to be Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King, of course, can't be there because he's just been killed. And so there's something about that adds a layer to that speech that's really important. So I think that's, so Baldwin's relationship with Christianity is give you a little sense of that, and definitely recommend folks check out, Baldwin's writings about that. And it's there from the beginning to the end. He's reflecting on his, kind of relationship to Christianity. On the question of Islam, I think that Baldwin there's a lot of really fascinating things to think about. Especially in connection to the Nation of Islam, the sect of Islam that Baldwin wrote the most about, in connection to Malcolm X and others. Baldwin's most famous book is The Fire Next Time, which is Buckley mentioned in his speech. And that book is this little book which everyone should check out. You actually can listen to it for free on audio on YouTube. For whatever reason, it's available for free. I'm not sure if there's any copyright problems, but it's been there for years, so I think it's okay. And everyone should check it out. But one of the things Baldwin does in that is he talks about the middle of that this long essay he writes. It's a 20,000 word essay that makes up most of that book that was published originally in the New Yorker in 1962. He reflects in the middle of that that essay on the Nation of Islam. And part of what he does is he talks about these encounters with Malcolm that I described earlier, and this dinner, this famous dinner he has in 1961 with the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. And what Baldwin says is that there's things about the Nation of Islam that he finds to be admirable. He sort of acknowledges that Elijah Muhammad has succeeded in sort of certain areas where generations of public officials and others have failed. And part of what he thinks Elijah Muhammad has done effectively is he has succeeded in providing a kind of sense of worth, a sense of self, of dignity in people's lives that had previously been missing. But he says, Baldwin says really powerfully, he says that the price of that dignity, though, from Baldwin's perspective, has been too high. He says, I care about the freedom of my people, but I also care about the health of their souls. And so Baldwin is suspicious of, in particular, the Nation of Islam in those days for what Baldwin saw as kind of promoting a philosophy that did not take that, constructing an identity that didn't have an enemy. And so Baldwin that's central to Baldwin's dispute with the Nation of Islam. And of course, his relationship with Malcolm is complicated, right? Because Malcolm leaves the Nation of Islam in 1964. So Baldwin, like so many others, was really interested in where Malcolm would go next with his evolution. And of course, we didn't get to find out because Malcolm was killed on February 21st, 1965.
I feel I can sort of shape the questions, right, to keep a dialogue going, but at the same point, I want to try to make it a bit more natural too. So I'm going to start moving us a bit more to the other side of this, right? So Clara asks, did Baldwin and Buckley read each other's works? Were they familiar with each other's works, or did they meet sort of just on the stage?
Yeah. So great question, Clara. Yeah. So Baldwin and Buckley. The thing that was sort of easier to find in this story was that Baldwin was definitely on Buckley's radar prior to the debate. So Buckley first begins to write about Baldwin in the early 1960s, and is writing about him, repeatedly in the years leading up to the debate. And so, basically from the beginning, Buckley identifies Baldwin as, the first thing he writes about Baldwin is he calls him a quote unquote tormented Negro writer. And he goes on to call him an eloquent menace. And so Buckley kind of sees Baldwin as a threat, and he identifies all these reasons why he thinks Baldwin is a kind of threat, to nothing less than Western civilization. And as he's watching Baldwin rise in fame in the early 60s, he's increasingly concerned about this. And so leading up to that night, even in the weeks leading up to the debate, Buckley writes columns about Baldwin. One of them, I say in the book, is subtly titled Hate America. And it's an essay about how much Baldwin hates America. And so there's no question about it. He was on Buckley's radar, and Buckley continued to write about Baldwin after the debate repeatedly, again, mostly reflecting on the debate and reasons why he thinks Baldwin prevailed by way of the vote, but lost really in terms of the argument. Buckley is obsessed with justifying himself that night. But Baldwin, on the other hand, doesn't give us as much textual evidence that he was thinking about Buckley prior to the debate. Now, one thing that's clear is that Buckley was, omnipresent enough on the cultural scene, and Baldwin was engaged enough with the American political scene that there's sort of little doubt, and I was sort of able to, get the closest I can to evidence of this from interviews with Baldwin's his sort of friends and colleagues and one of his biographers, that there was no doubt that he knew of Buckley and kind of knew basically where Buckley stood. And in the lead up to the debate itself, if nothing else, Baldwin was not necessarily engaging in advanced preparation, but he was, in the lead up to the debate, had enough time to sort of get to know a little bit of Buckley's views on civil rights. And so one of the things that's interesting is, in the aftermath of the debate, one of the things I argue in the book is that Baldwin writes this piece that was, the timing of it was really remarkable. It was basically after that second encounter with Buckley on the show Open End, within days, and that was the night that didn't go well for Baldwin. Within days, Baldwin is invited to write an essay for Ebony magazine, and the theme of the issue was was the white problem. And so they were flipping this kind of quote unquote Negro problem, which was the term that so many people are using in the day. And Ebony magazine said, let's write an issue about the white problem. And Baldwin writes that essay, and we kind of know from the evidence in the archives the window in which he had to write the essay, which was a small window. He writes that essay right in the aftermath of this really bad encounter with Buckley. And in that essay he writes is called The White Man's Guilt. And although Buckley is not named in the piece, I argue in the book there's a lot of reasons to believe that Buckley was on Baldwin's mind. So everybody should check out that essay for sure to get a kind of a sense of Baldwin kind of thinking out loud about Buckley.
Wonderful. Victoria asked here about Buckley. Why would Buckley blame it on the Negro community if the Negro men were restricted to opportunity that the white community didn't have? So what was that argument that Buckley was making, that there was responsibility within the community itself?
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. So, I mean, the argument that Buckley made went something like this. I mean, so basically Buckley, concedes, and this is something that he did off and on over the course of the 60s. Sort of watching Buckley, and what I try to do in the book is really, think in slow motion with Buckley, kind of watch him evolving over the course of the 60s as he's losing these battles. And there's a lot to that story that's really important. But one of the things he does is he starts adapting his response a little bit to, basically he says, he had said way back in 1957, right, that white people have an obligation to not take advantage of their position of power and to actually promote kind of cultural equality, and that cultural equality could be the basis of political rights one day when black folks are ready, is the way Buckley would say it. And so part of what he does as he's evolving into the 60s is he says, and he points to things that are being written by, he likes to point out, by liberals like Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Nathan Glazer, who are trying to look at in a social scientific way, a kind of explanation of racial inequality. And so what Buckley says is that it's clear, he points to these social scientists, he does this in the Cambridge speech, and he says, it's clear, Buckley argues, that there are opportunities available that are not being taken advantage of. So the question is why, and he argues that part of the reason why is because leaders like Baldwin are failing to, promote those opportunities with folks who are listening to them. Now, what I think one of the ways Baldwin kind of responds to questions like that, and Baldwin gets that question a lot over the course of his public life, and he gets that question about a little over a year before he encounters Buckley. He gets this question from a journalist in Florida who says, isn't it true that white people are doing all these terrible things, but this journalist says, but aren't black people being too lethargic? And that's a quote from this journalist. And Baldwin says, I have not met a great many people who are lethargic, but I have met a great many people who are demoralized, and those are two different things. And so what Baldwin wants to argue in response to this kind of cultural argument on racial inequality that we still see, and we can turn on a news channel or go to a website right now and see it repeatedly, out there, is that Baldwin says that there's a kind of demoralization that happens that we saw. I think you see him talking about it a little bit in that speech. When he says at a very young age, you have people who are being acculturated to believe that the world is set up in such a way that they are not going to have the same opportunities as others. And just he wants us to think about what that does to one's sense of self, what that does to one's sense of motivation, what that does to one's sense of the opportunities that one might have in life. And so that's, I think, the central kind of Baldwinian response. And so that, and I think, I think I've tried to capture what I think Buckley would say in response to the question as well.
Wonderful. Another question here about Buckley. Andrew asks, is Buckley correct in his assertion that race is a moral issue? We keep getting laws passed, and the problem doesn't seem to go away. So how much can law actually change something if it resides in the human soul?
Thank you, Andrew, for that question. Yeah, and so one of the things that Baldwin and Buckley, there are these kind of weird moments. Of course, my presentation has emphasized, all these points of contrast, but there are these points where they agree about something. And usually it's the case that when they agree for they have an agreement about a conclusion for radically different reasons. So so this is one point on which they agreed, and that fundamentally Baldwin, and he says this at Cambridge, he says that all these laws that are being passed but from Baldwin's perspective, they're very important and they need to be passed. And he's hoping that the outcomes of judicial decisions and legislative battles and elections go the way that he thinks they need to go to achieve justice. But he says that underneath all of that, right, underneath all of these issues are fundamentally questions of the soul. And so he thinks there is a moral problem here that has to be addressed, or we will never escape the trap, right? We will never escape this kind of cycle. And so that, Buckley has a similar point, but again, for very different reasons. So Buckley says that fundamentally these are matters of the soul, and that really so from Buckley's perspective, this is one of the reasons why he's resisting legislative solutions. He's saying these things can't be legislated. So he's one of the reasons he's opposing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and so on is that these pieces of legislation need to be resisted, among other things, because these are fundamentally matters of the soul. Now, that's of course a point of radical disagreement between the two. But what Buckley says, the kind of moral argument that he makes, and he makes this in the Cambridge speech, is that the moral argument that he makes is that what we need to do is change what he calls the warp and woof of our moral lives, so that more white people feel concern about these issues. And he says that the engines of concern are working in the United States, and that white people do care, and that what James Baldwin needs to be careful of is that he does not offend those white people who are there to help him, is what Buckley says in the speech. So Buckley has this kind of moral argument that's still kind of a little bit patronizing, I think we could say. And what's fascinating is that Baldwin pushes back against that, right? And in the speech itself, but Buckley doesn't seem to have heard him. Baldwin says, "I am not an object of missionary charity." Baldwin absolutely loathed a kind of politics of concern, whether it came from conservatives or liberals, that treated him as if he was an object of missionary charity. Baldwin says, "I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country." And so Baldwin's moral argument is different from Buckley's. Baldwin says our sort of the fundamental moral question before us is, are we willing, are we able to come to terms with our history, to come to terms with all that we have done? And Baldwin would, he said repeatedly, we need to come to terms with our history, not because I'm worried about your guilt, right? He says, I know you didn't do it. I didn't do it either. This is not about guilt, it's about responsibility. History is present in everything we do. And so Baldwin is calling on all of us to come to terms with our history so that we can take responsibility for where we are in the present. That's Baldwin's moral lesson. And that's where I think there's still this gap between what Buckley is asking us to do and what Baldwin is asking us to do.
Wonderful. Natalie asked you, Nick, can you speak more on Baldwin and his community's generational trauma?
Yeah, wow. Now that's a great question. One thing I'll do is I'll put in a plug for a book that's come out recently called Begin Again by my friend Eddie Glad, who in many ways that book is kind of it sort of picks up in a lot of ways where my book leaves off. So my book kind of leaves off in 1965 with a little bit in the epilogue about the years between 65 and 68. And Eddie is really interested in the sort of later Baldwin, sort of the Baldwin of what he calls the after times. Baldwin from that period in the late 60s through the end of his life in 1987. And what I think is really central, and the reason I mention that is because this idea of trauma, of collective trauma, is absolutely central to the story that Eddie is telling in Begin Again, and I think it's absolutely crucial. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so much to say here. I mean, Baldwin is somebody who's definitely sensitive to this idea of trauma, of pain, of the kind of collective trauma. And I think Baldwin, from going back to going back to the beginning of his writings, but 1955, one line that comes to mind that is really, I think, powerful is Baldwin says, he's talking about his father. He's talking about this guy, David Baldwin, who he says, is consumed by despair. And he's talking about all the ways in which he sees his father as fundamentally hating the world, hating himself, hating most of the people around him. And Baldwin says that one of the reasons I think that people cling to hate is because they are so scared if they let the hate go, they'll have to deal with pain, right? So there's something going on there that's extraordinarily important. And so, I mean, I think part of what the way Baldwin grapples with trauma, right, is I think this is maybe implied in the question, is that Baldwin thinks that history is simultaneously going to, if we really come to terms with history, right, we're coming to terms both in terms of our personal history, our collective history, we're inviting a lot of pain in, right, but we're also inviting, Baldwin thinks, the keys to our salvation. So Baldwin says, when you think about Black history and sort of the story of collective trauma, he says that that's a history that is and he says this in really powerfully in The Fire Next Time. That is a history in which there's so much pain, there's so much horror, and he has this list of things, this kind of catalog of disaster that he describes, this bloody catalog of disaster. But it's also a story of so much resistance, so much resilience, and so much joy. And so Baldwin says that one of the ways that kind of coming to terms with our history individually and collectively that's so important is that we find in our own history, right, in these moments of trauma, how we were able to survive, right? And in those stories of survival, as individuals and as members of groups, we have so much to learn, right? So there's this line in The Fire Next Time, which is this extraordinarily powerful line in which he's reflecting in particular about Black history. And Baldwin says, "I'm calling on my fellow countrymen, every one of my fellow countrymen, to become Black." That's a line from Baldwin in The Fire Next Time. And that is a line that sort of like a lot of people read that and they go, what does he mean by that? What does it mean to become Black? And part of what he says, and part of interpreters of Baldwin have argued, like Cornel West, have said, he's calling on us to become a blues people, right? And part of what he loves about the blues, Baldwin loves about the blues and sees so much wisdom in the blues, is that the blues are simultaneously about tremendous, tremendous pain and trauma, individually and collectively. And at the same time, they're about resilience and they're about joy, right? And how we survive those moments of trauma. So that's a long-winded answer to a really important question, but hopefully there's something useful there.
Absolutely. We have lots of so I'll go to one here that's a little bit different, but one that's getting some popularity, some likes, I guess you would say, right? Jake asks, is the strange way that Buckley spoke during the debate a tactic, or is that just his natural speaking habit?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Yeah, the style of William F. Buckley Jr. So Buckley's manner, that's Buckley. I mean, there are certain lines that have become sort of famous when I'm at home, so like, my wife Emily and I will like to say, something like, the way Buckley says discuss, and there's certain things in there that are, there's another line that he uses where, like Baldwin is treated with a considerable degree of unction. There's Buckley, that's Buckley, that's Buckley, that's who he was, and that's not, he's not putting anything on there. That's who he was, going back to his childhood. I mean, there's evidence that the guy, when he's a kid, he marches into the faculty meeting at his prep school and begins lecturing his teachers, unannounced, uninvited, lecturing his teachers during their lunch hour on the dignity of the Catholic Church and his America First political views. So, and he delivered it in that same way. I bet it would get, sort of like maybe he was going through puberty or something, so his voice might have cracked in the middle. But that's the way the guy spoke. And I think there's a lot of things written about why Buckley spoke that way. Having to do with, he has this household in which his mother's, from New Orleans, his father's from Texas, his tutors, he has tutors that are, and servants in the household that are speaking Spanish and French, and his father was also bilingual and spoke Spanish around the house as well. and he spends a little bit of time at a boarding school in England. So there's all, and he's, the family also has an estate in South Carolina, so there's all these mixtures of things that are happening. And so a couple of the Buckley children, not all of them, a couple of them spoke in that way. And I've had sort of interesting kind of fan mail over the months since the book came out. One of the pieces that comes to mind is somebody who, because I have a passage in the book where I kind of reflect on why Buckley spoke this way, and this person wrote to me and said, I have the answer, and I'm trying to think of the exact phrase he uses. I'm gonna get the location wrong, but dang it, it's Long Island lockjaw or something. There's some phrase he used. It was a lockjaw was part of it. And so part of what I say in the book, though, is that there's all these kind of interesting theories of the origins of why Buckley spoke that way. But one of the paragraphs I really enjoyed writing in the book was about Buckley as performer. And so although everything I just said, like he wasn't performing, that I believe all that, but I also believe there's part of Buckley, and he goes on to have this show the year after he debates Baldwin in 1966. Buckley launches Firing Line, the show that he was the host of for 33 years. And he became this cultural fixture. He was such a cultural fixture that they were imitating him on Saturday Night Live. So you can watch videos of Robin Williams doing his William F. Buckley impression. And so part of what Buckley did is he kind of made conservatism cool. There was a generations of young conservatives who wanted to be just like William F. Buckley. He had this kind of style to him. And so he kind of like, in 1967, he's on the cover of Time magazine, and the headline is "Conservatism Can Be Fun." And so Buckley, that way of speaking was the way he spoke. And I also have students ask me about Baldwin's, sort of matter of speaking, and that line about British accents. We can talk about if you want. What Buckley says Baldwin spoke with British accents. There's a lot going on there. But Baldwin, like that was not like that's the way Baldwin spoke. So like we look back at like videos of the way people spoke in the 50s and 60s, people like Buckley and Baldwin, and we sort of see it as like, really, did they talk like that? But yeah, that's how they spoke, and there's a lot going on there as to why, but that's how they spoke.
Wonderful. I'm going to pair these questions together because Ethan and Dakota are asking very similar things. So Dakota asked, was Baldwin present at the "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington? And Ethan sort of builds off that and asks, if he wasn't there, why wasn't he allowed there, or why wasn't he there?
Yeah, great question. I'm just grabbing the book here so I can, if I can find it quickly enough, I can show you an image of Baldwin at the March on Washington. And so, yeah, so Baldwin was there. So Baldwin, he called himself a transatlantic commuter. And so he ended up he came back, as I said, he lives in, Paris most of the time from 48 to 57. He comes back to the U.S. in 57. There we go. There's Baldwin at the March on Washington. So I'll hold that up to the camera so people can see Baldwin there with Marlon Brando and Charlton Heston. So Baldwin was at the March on Washington. So he's actually in Paris in the lead up to the March on Washington, but he comes back to participate. And Baldwin ends up writing so while he's in Paris, he and several other Americans in Paris put together this petition in support of the march. And Baldwin writes the text of the petition, sort of what they're signing on to and why they think this is such an important moment in American history. They call it a sort of a great moment in a sort of a second American Revolution or a third American Revolution. They call it an American Revolutionary moment. And Baldwin, he says that he writes this piece, and he comes to the March on Washington, and to get to the perfect pairing of things, Ben. Here in wine country, we appreciate a good pairing, and you paired the questions well, because Baldwin does not appear at the lectern. He does not appear at the at the microphones. And even though his petition was read, and it's read by a white actor named Burt Lancaster, who had signed it as well. And so why is Baldwin kept from the microphones that night? Well, there's a few different theories about this. One is that Malcolm X says, Malcolm X in those days was very critical. He called it the farce on Washington. And Malcolm X says in 1964, he says, Jimmy Baldwin was denied the right to speak at the March on Washington. Why? Because Jimmy, you never know what Jimmy's going to say. And so they wanted to, Jimmy, if he had the microphone, right, they were worried that he might say something that would be too radical. So that's Malcolm's take on it. There are others who say that Baldwin's sexuality was a concern, that the organizers of the march, and Bayard Rustin was kind of the key organizer, and he himself was gay, but he was allowed to speak, but he was also kept out of the spotlight in a lot of ways because of his sexuality. And then a third explanation is, and we know this because of the FBI. So one thing I say, often is that, the FBI was surveilling all of these people. Baldwin's FBI file turned out to be 1,800 pages. They're surveilling Martin Luther King. They're surveilling Malcolm X. They're surveilling Elijah Muhammad. So although that is horrific that our government was surveilling these people, one of the things that we have now as writers is they were providing us with historical information. And so we know from the FBI files that Martin Luther King and those around Martin Luther King were worried about Baldwin because, in the words of one of King's advisors, they say Baldwin is occasionally guilty of poetical exaggeration, and that they were very concerned about King appearing on camera with Baldwin because they were worried that Baldwin would say something too radical, and that they didn't want, although King was a radical, right, in all sorts of important ways, they were worried that there was a kind of way in which Baldwin's message might be too radical to accomplish the legislative goals they were trying to accomplish. So yeah, it's a really sad moment in the story where you see Baldwin. There's also an image of him that's famous. You can pull up, Google images of Baldwin at the march, where he's out in the audience, stoically, observing with these aviator sunglasses on, and there's kind of a hint of sadness, in this moment where he is identified as a kind of the poet of the revolution, and he's being denied access to that stage. And so Baldwin, it's definitely a difficult moment for Baldwin in a lot of ways, but he was there, and I think his ideas were there in a lot of different ways as well.
And look, I may not be from wine country, but in Chicago we know about pairing. It's called a hot dog and a PBR. Okay, we know these things.
That's right. And I can appreciate that pairing as well.
That's right. Well, we have a question here from one of our professors, Paul. He says, it sounds like Buckley's argument is similar to today's Black accountability argument, which has some support among the Black community. So does Baldwin oppose the stance of holding the Black community accountable for their actions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, and so the kind of language of accountability that also in contemporary discourse we sometimes call this like respectability politics. There's definitely I think that I would sort of frame the question a little bit differently, and that Baldwin, I think it's sort of like, for Baldwin, the question of whether one is for a kind of respectability politics or against it, I think kind of is the wrong way to think about it from Baldwin's perspective. And so in part, Baldwin would ask us to think about what's underneath this discourse, right? I mean, Baldwin is always kind of trying to get at what lies beneath it. And so part of what I think Baldwin's going to say, in some ways, there's a sort of sense in which Baldwin is a kind of figure who, as in terms of his lifestyle and the sort of life that the way he thought of himself, he would often call himself a disreputable man, right? And he took that as a sort of had that as a badge of honor. So there's a kind of way in which Baldwin is a kind of, he wouldn't like being called a bohemian, but in some ways, if we just have bohemian and bourgeois as our categories, Baldwin's more on the bohemian side. But on the other hand, he's watching around him. He's sort of seeing a kind of respectability politics form, and he's actually somebody who's willing and able to engage in really important conversations and alliances with people who are more closely associated with, kind of respectability politics of the era. So, for example, Baldwin is not only having conversations about these things with figures like Malcolm X and eventually folks in the Black Power movement, he's also having conversations with figures like Whitney Young in the Urban League and sort of the NAACP, which in those days was definitely much more closely associated with a kind of Black bourgeois respectability politics. And so I think Baldwin is not sort of interested in an either or conversation about these things. Of course, he recognizes the ways in which our individual behavior is related to various, social outcomes. I think that that's, something that he sees. On the other hand, again, he's sort of always there to sort of remind us of what lies beneath all that. And just the example I like to give is that on all of these questions, whether it's a big legislative debate or a kind of cultural debate about respectability politics versus various radical, lifestyles, or however you want to phrase it, Baldwin is always there to kind of ask this question, yes, but. I mean, I say that Baldwin, it doesn't let anybody off the hook, and he's always there to say yes, but. So if there's a moment, if there's a good point made about respectability politics, Baldwin is there to say yes, but. If there's a big piece of legislation passed, he's always there to say yes, but. If there's an election that turns out the way we want it to turn out, he's there to say yes, but. And the yes, but, ... leads to for Baldwin he will ask this question of us. He says, how does the world, based on whatever you just told me that may be true, we just achieved a victory on this or that, or you just made a good point, where does that leave us in terms of the average teenager at the, who's at the margins of any one of our country's many, many ghettos, is what Baldwin would ask us, right? And so he is always there to ask us that question. And in that question, I think is the one that I think this Baldwin is right about this, right? He wants to say, and the respectability politics are the last point I'll make about this, then I'll shut up. Baldwin says, and he describes this very vividly in the major essay of Down at the Cross, which is In the Fire Next Time. He says that he looks around him at the opportunities available, right, to somebody in his position at the margins in Harlem in the 20s and 30s, and we can update that argument, to here we are almost 100 years later. And Baldwin says, what I recognized pretty quickly is, although I was, James Baldwin says, somebody who was interested in books and interested in learning, I recognized, I was able to see in the generation ahead of me that I couldn't read, there weren't enough books in the world that I could read that would protect me from the world that I saw around me. I couldn't save enough pennies to protect me from the world I saw around me. So not to say, that doesn't mean he says we shouldn't read books and save our pennies, but he does also say that we need to confront some structural inequalities, these bottomlessly cruel structures of power that are limiting the freedom and fulfillment of so many of the human beings around us. So that's, I think, part of what Baldwin would say in response. But thank you for the question. It's definitely a really important one.
And I'm going to steal some more time from you if we can, Nick, because I know we've kept you over time and our audience is sticking around, but this is just a fabulous conversation, and we won't be able to get to all questions, I think, tonight. We have 16 still in the queue, and I just can't even turn the queue off.
Wow.
I know.
Jackson, I think you're setting a record for questions. I love it.
Here's the thing. I think this just proves, once we are over, why we're going to get you here to campus, because there's a conversation to still be had. So if I could steal you for just a couple more questions, Nick, I think we would appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So this comes from another professor in our department, but he's also used to be a member of Congress. So you got some high praise coming here, because Glenn Browder said he enjoyed your presentation, both the information and the enthusiasm. And what he's wondering is, can you relate this presentation to Tocqueville's writing about the essence or the future of democracy? And what he's thinking about is, what might be the takeaway for those of us who are trying to understand the account of our country's basic nature, its strengths, and its weaknesses?
Wow.
I know.
Well, thank you, Professor Browder. That's a big question. Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple ways into that question, and I can't do the question justice, but I'll try to say something useful. So I mean, one thing I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm sort of, this is sort of a spin-off project that I'll probably write about at some point, is, and this is, I'll sort of start with something general and then maybe try to bring it a little closer down to the earth. I don't know if Professor Browder is a political theorist or not, but he mentioned Tocqueville, so I'll take the theory opportunity to do a little theory. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me about this contrast, or putting these two figures together, is the sort of different conceptions of love in Baldwin and Buckley. And so love is really important to both of these figures. not just as a philosophical idea, but more specifically, the question of love of country. And I think there's something really fascinating going on here. So nobody steal this idea, because I'm going to write about it. But so one thing, if you think about, right, the etymology of patriotism, right, this love, sort of that root word, right, the father, the sort of love of the fatherland, and or devotion to the fatherland. And I've been thinking a lot about Buckley and Baldwin and fathers, and this is something my friend Susan McWilliams, a wonderful political theorist at Pomona College, she's written a little bit about this in connection to the debate. That Buckley uses this line, "Faith of our fathers," in his speech, and there's something about Buckley and Baldwin and their fathers that's really important, and I think it manifests itself. So you have Baldwin, who has this kind of antagonistic relationship with his father, and you have Buckley, who has this really this sort of relationship with his father, in which he is, and I don't want to psychoanalyze here, but he's his mission, right, is to please his father and to defend the worldview that his father taught him, and to really defend the worldview that his father taught him made their tremendous life possible. And so there's something going on there, right? And so what I say about this in the book a little bit, and I'm developing a little bit more, is that if we take that and sort of look at how it applies to their understanding of patriotism and what does it mean to love the country, Buckley's love is a love of devotion, right? It is a love like the love we hope the parents hope they get from their children, and it's not unconditional, but it's a love of devotion. It's definitely that kind of love. Whereas Baldwin says, and he says this in 1955, he says, "It is because I love this country," speaking of the United States of America, "that I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually," right? So it is a love. Baldwin says later in, as he's developing his philosophy of love, love is confrontation, love is war, love is a battle, right? So what do we do with that, right? And so very interestingly, I come back to the father theme, is that late in his life, Baldwin says, not only does he love his father, but he has a moment when he's writing about an adaptation of his first novel, Go Tell on the Mountain, which is an amazing novel everyone should read, and the depiction of the character who's like Baldwin's father in this autobiographical novel, this character Gabriel. I mean, it is a searing indictment of this human being, this character, right? And Baldwin says, late in life, in the 1980s, Baldwin says, "When I look back at that story now, I realize it's a love letter to my father." And I'm like, damn, that's quite a love letter. So that's all long-winded way of saying that I think part of what, and we see this, right, so much in our political culture, the sort of just driving around, right? And I don't, it's probably a little different scene in Alabama, than it is in Portland, Oregon, but like sort of driving around and you pass different neighborhoods where there's one kind of flag, and another neighborhood where there's another kind of flag. And that happens here in Oregon, and obviously it manifests itself in different ways in different places. But there again, we have this fundamental disagreement about what it is, going back to the sort of really core of the question of this project, right? This American project, and what it means, and what our history means, and what our and how our understanding of that history sort of manifests itself in our responsibility to the present, in the present. And so I think, part of what Baldwin and Buckley provide us, and one of the things I say, when I talk about the book, is this is a very different way of doing political theory, a very different way of doing political theory that I was used to as I started to work on the book. But there's something about it, thinking in slow motion with these two figures and thinking with them, through this time period, that I found to be, extraordinarily illuminating. And I don't know, and hopefully it's illuminating for readers as well. And so part of that, though, I think, is that, and this is where that idea that Baldwin gives us is so powerful, is that Baldwin says history is present in everything that we do. And so thinking about this history together, as we're doing tonight with all these, 1645 questions in the queue, is thinking about these questions together it's not just worth doing because we love history and we love political theory and these sorts, and we love old books. It's because it matters to how, in terms of how we make sense of our responsibilities in the moment. And Buckley and Baldwin, as different as they are, I think understanding both of their stories and everything that their stories represent is absolutely crucial to our lives as citizens.
Yeah, I want to be a glutton. There's some really great questions here, and I want to keep asking them. But I also know, we have lives, and I know we told people we would end at 8:30, and we've gone 45 minutes. I feel like Socrates, right? At the Republic, right? Where I'm a glutton for the questions, and we're never going to get to dinner or the festival. We're just going to keep asking.
Yeah, one thing I can say for the sake of everybody's, because everybody's got a lot going on, and I think I've already said this to Ben via emails, I would be happy to do a follow-up, if you, just a more informal Q&A discussion with all of you anytime. I would love to make that happen. So I definitely don't want those left on the question queue to feel left out. So if Ben wants to arrange that, absolutely. If that's not on the cards, by all means, you can feel free to shoot me an email. And my email is pretty easy, just my name, nicholasbuccola@gmail.com. So I'm pretty easy to find. So yeah, definitely, I really appreciate what a great group of questions, and yeah, we've been at it a long time, but it's great. I love it. So yeah, I really appreciate, Ben, you hosting me, and you're such a gracious host, and I really appreciate all the folks sticking around for this long, and definitely we'll keep the conversation going for sure.
Absolutely. Let's find a way to have this Q&A session so we can keep talking. I will save these questions here that haven't got asked, but we'll try to get people back together. I said we'll try to get you to campus as soon as we can. And Nick, I just want to thank you. I said this was a wonderful first lecture. We're very appreciative of the Jack Miller Center for funding this so we could get you here and so we can keep doing more of these. I leave this a little dizzy, and I know that's a good experience if I'm dizzy because I got things I need to sort out. And I really appreciate you sharing us all this work, because I know this was a project that wasn't done just for this. You've been working on this for years. This was a labor of love, and it just really, I appreciate you getting to share all this information with us in such an informative, engaging, and an exciting way.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I think that because I'm the inaugural Tocqueville lecturer, you can tell all future lecturers that they are all required to take no fewer than 25 questions.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I think that's the bar now. That's can you go to 15 rounds, right?
Yeah, I love it. But thank you for your kind words, Ben. That really means a lot to me. And I do appreciate hearing that a lot, because part of what's been so rewarding about this book is the ways in which I've reached beyond the walls of the academy, and a lot of people are reacting to it, and I anything I can do to contribute to meaningful conversations about ideas that matter, I'm very happy about that. So I really appreciate your kind words.
Well, thank you again. Thank you for all of you for attending, for sticking around. Please, as I said, follow the link to the Facebook page so you can know about future events. And once again, I wish we could give you the round of applause you deserved it, but thank you very much. It was a great presentation and wonderful question and answer.
Thank you, Ben. Have a good night, everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Good night, everyone.